So with some of 40k's strongest armies taking big hits recently, let's take a look at what's doing well in the new meta. Let's take a look at some tournament victories and first army win rates after the nerfs and see what's doing well. Hello and welcome back to Auspex Tactics, where today we're talking 40k army performance and basically taking an early look at what seems to be doing well after Games Workshop's emergency nerfs. This one maybe feels like a bit of an unusual one, as Games Workshop's big changes that they did nerfed 3 of the strongest factions in Warhammer 40k, Imperial Knights, Chaos Knights and Death Guard. They left the rest of the factions in the game untouched. If they're getting any updates, then they'll come in the next balanced data slate one, which Games Workshop confirmed will be sometime in September. As a result, at least on the face of it, you probably wouldn't expect the majority of armies to have changed in power level quite so much. Though given that those armies tended to be winning in a very big damage and defense style way, it might mean that some unusual armies that were rather repressed rise up a bit. Stuff that was specifically bad against Knights and Death Guard maybe having a bit more time to shine. We had a few tournaments use the updated points cost last week, though the majority of the big ones tended not to. So this one's really been the first full weekend when we've had the new points in effect across the board. There have been a fair few bigger events, including Games Workshop's Nova Open. For the first places to report on these sorts of stats, Meta Monday usually tend to be the first to publish win rates, so I thought it would be fun to take a look through their data with the initial Grand Tournament win rates. Full credit and big respects to them, of course, for those. And otherwise, just for a general sense as to what armies are doing well, I thought we could take a look at some initially successful lists from Best Coast Pairings, and it seems that Goonhammer's 40k Stat Center has at least a little bit of casual game data. So I thought that would be interesting to take a look at as well, as a bit of a counterpart to the Grand Tournament things, as there usually tend to be more games reported casually than in Grand Tournaments. Obviously this is super early days yet, and I'd always say that you never really want to interpret 1 week's tournament data with any great certainty. Armies just do well or badly at random. I treat it more as a first glimpse and maybe a hint as to what might be strong or not, as opposed to the defined thing. This entire temporary meta might be shattered quite quickly, of course. We know there's a balance update at some point within the next few weeks. I'm going to guess probably not this Wednesday, though I might be wrong. Maybe next Wednesday could be a possibility. But knowing how armies are getting on in the interim, I think it's pretty useful for interpreting the changes coming up. Before we jump into it properly, I'll just give a quick shout out to today's video sponsor in the Bourbon City Brawl, and they just wanted to get the word out about their 40k Grand Tournament that's happening in Kentucky, a 64-player 2,000 point event happening just south of Louisville in Kentucky. The event's happening as part of a wider gaming convention, the Grand Tournament on the 4th and 5th of October, and apparently they have some early bird pricing for tickets on sale until the 7th of September. I believe $75 total for the 2-day tournament between the entry badge and the admission fee for the event. They've got plenty of other things in game systems to check out if you're local as well, and you can find them linked down in the video description if you'd like to check them out. In any case, a big thank you to them for sponsoring this one. Let's get into it though, and for this video I thought I'd mainly focus on the armies that seem to be doing well towards the top end of the meta. I feel like with the changes that have happened, the only ones that you'd really expect to see having really major changes in their fortune are the ones that were doing kind of well before. Given that the armies that were struggling a bit haven't really changed quite so much, the main changes have been to the top end of the 40k meta. The armies that were winning the most, both in terms of events and win rates, have all been nerfed, so perhaps the biggest question is what rises up to challenge for new strongest armies, at least before any future balance passes. It seems that top of the shop for the tournament win rates for 1 week's worth of data are the Thousand Sons so far. No real big surprise that they're going to be somewhere towards the top. They were already one of the most successful armies by the numbers, besides the Death Guard and Knights before. It seems their first weekend Grand Tournament win rates are around 58%, though really quite a big difference between that and their casual win rates. Goonhammer seems to have them at 47% there. For placing towards the tops of tournaments though, both for this weekend and last weekend, they've had 2 event wins and 2 more Thousand Sons army lists go undefeated, and 10 high placings where they've just taken 1 loss. That's certainly a very, very strong start on multiple metrics compared with the rest of the armies out there. The Thousand Sons in general have just been pretty powerful since their codex came out. Some pretty punchy combos of psychic damage between their army rules with their psychic powers, and often combinations of sorcerers and Rubik Marines jumping out of rhinos to deal damage, maybe Magnus himself as well, usually all in their most successful detachment currently, which is the Grand Coven. It gives you amped up psychic damage, some useful stratagems including re-rolling tests and blanking saves, and pretty much all of the enhancements fairly stand out strong for the sorcerers. Here's one of the Grand Tournament winning lists from last week by Alex Fowler. This one has Magnus himself backed up by 4 sorcerers and a Zangor Shaman. Many of the sorcerers doing some big damage with Rubik Marines, maybe some of them jumping out of a Chaos Rhino for boosted psychic damage there. And then there's a sorcerer on disc and Zangor Shaman to lead some of those enlightened with great bows, which is a very fast and very efficient data sheet all around. It also has some punchy Mutalith beasts with good stats and a helpful special rule, and some Zangors for returning to reserves. Next up, one of the other clearly strong armies from the stats so far are the Aeldari. Again, the Space Elves were doing rather well prior to any of the points nerfs for other factions, maybe with a lower standout win rate compared with some, but it seems that if you knew how to play the faction really well, then they could achieve some pretty mad results. Lots and lots of grand tournament placings that were successful both before and after the update. It seems that over the last 2 weeks, Aeldari have won no less than 5 grand tournaments, which is pretty crazy, and also had a good number of high placings besides. Despite that, like before, it doesn't look like their win rates are crazily well overblown. It seems 50% for their first week tournament data, a little higher in the casual datasets. The Aeldari did seem to be doing pretty well in the previous meta, and they seem to have a good matchup into Knights in particular. Lots of fast units that can run away and hide and don't fight the Knights on a 1-for-1 damage and defense kind of game. I was wondering whether or not they might drop off a tiny bit if they don't have the natural army that they're countering quite so prevalent, but clearly seems not. The vast majority of their army lists are building around foot aspect warrior lists, usually using either the war host or the aspect host formations, both of which have really good support for those units. Their biggest win since the update was this list by Folger Piles, taking first at the Nova Open. Games Workshop's enormous grand tournament, and this one goes very heavy on the Phoenix Lords even compared with other lists. Fugan with a huge squad of Fire Dragons, Janezar with some Howling Banshees, Lycus with the Powerblade Exarch Warp Spiders, and pretty interesting to see Morgan Ra on the table as well. I've certainly not seen so many people using him. They've got Eldrad for some command points and dooming something if necessary, and then a pretty spectacular amount of Aeldari objective and interference units, 3 sets of Swooping Hawks and 2 other sets of Warp Spiders, plus some Corsair Void Reavers as cheap expendable units with some OC, and some nice cheap infiltrating Rangers. Looks like some of them are getting to the fight in transports too. The Fire Dragons have worked very well with that Wave Serpent, and there's a Falcon tank as well that I guess might have the Dark Reapers and Morgan Ra in them. Overall certainly looks scary, though as with Aeldari normally, I feel like they're a very player skill dependent faction. Lots of fragile units that can be dead very quickly if they're exposed or not used to the maximum of their potential. The same as that could be said for the Genestealer Cults as well. Again, for their on-paper stats, they maybe had claim to fame as perhaps the other single highest performing faction outside of the Knights and Death Guard prior to updates. Previously, they'd had GT wins of around 55%, and in terms of the actual Grand Tournament overall victories, they'd had 9 big event wins, and I believe that put them as the very most overblown faction in terms of people turning up and taking down tournaments with them, even more so than the Death Guard despite their track record, just because of the numbers of players being quite so disparate. So far it seems they're absolutely trucking on with that same win rate, around about 55% or so. It looks like no player took down a grand tournament with them since the updates, though there were absolutely loads of high placings, so I feel like that's more of a case of just bad luck on any one weekend, and I'm sure we'll see far more from them. On paper they're certainly looking like one of the stronger armies of the game until Games Workshop do any balancer patches. For the ways that they're winning, the big list at the moment seems to be the Host of Ascension, usually big shooting neophyte blocks, backed up by the Primus or maybe the Benefactus, and then backed up by their good combos of utility units, things like the Achilles Ridge Runner. The Acolytes are both really interesting in small numbers, as are Jackals and Pure Strains, and most of the other detachments are really strongly playable as well. People still seeing some success with Bisanctic Brood Surge, Final Day and Outlander Claw as well. Next up, it still seems that the Death Guard are putting up a really good performance. It doesn't look like points rise have put people off taking them in any big way. They're still the most played competitive faction this past weekend. It seems that their performance stats maybe have tailed off at least a little bit though. Their initial win rates are 50%, though more casually it's a little higher than that. It still seems they're well capable of topping events. They've won 2 of them and have 15 high placings. I guess higher numbers there than some of the others talked about, though given so many people have been turning up with them to play, the actual amount of tournament wins and high placings maybe isn't quite so overly impressive. Feels like they're overall a fair bit more back in line with other top factions as opposed to being excessively better than them. It's certainly early days yet though. I was interested to take a look as to which units might be getting taken or not for the Death Guard now. From first impressions from the points nerfs, it felt like a lot of things were a bit more fairly costed, though still the vast majority of things they had increased in cost were still pretty playable and strong. Just one example of a particularly successful list over the past weekend, there's this one by Derek Apshee from 40k Dirtbags, using this Death Guard list to place 3rd at the Nova Open. It's a virulent Vectorian one, and it does seem that a few more people are choosing to play that versus Mortarian's Hammer at least in the last weekend, and so overall feels more or less what you might have had before for the Death Guard, not a crazy amount of difference. Mortarian being taken is maybe the single biggest difference here, at least from the cookie cutter Death Guard builds, otherwise the unit breakdown at least feels fairly similar. Maybe 1 or 2 less of the demon engines than you might have had otherwise. Beyond that though, it still seems that Lords of Contagion with Death Shroud Terminators are well worth it with their scary deep strike charges. Having lots of Poxwalkers are good, the demon engines are still efficient enough to do well, the Blighthauler Bloat Drones and Mephitic Blightaulers both solidly valuable here, plus there's a Demon Prince of Nurgle. I certainly wouldn't be too surprised to see a few more Plague units making their way into these lists though, given that they were one of the scary danger units that didn't get big nerfs. Next up, we've got the Sisters of Battle, another faction are certainly expecting to do rather well after updates. They didn't really have too many high placings in the tournaments the week before, though it seems to have done kind of well in this past week. A 53% win rate according to Meta Monday, not so different to that in casual play, and despite usually having a small player base, they've done rather well on the tournament performance, already getting an event win with Champions of Faith, some high placings beyond that, and overall it certainly still feels reflective of how well they were doing before. Good win rates and plenty of tournament wins relative to the amount of players that were using them. For the Sisters, it seems that it's the Hallowed Martyrs and the Champions of Faith that are leading the way. Hallowed Martyrs having some good support for melee units, and in particular for characters. Often lots and lots of individual characters being run, maybe more than Val for some Resurrect on Death with her Paragon suits. That's the one that's been winning the vast majority of tournaments, but interesting to see a Champions of Faith list have some good success here. This one was apparently used by Sam Young to take first at Roll for Damage GT, going 6-0 undefeated, and the Champions of Faith one is the one that really supports the Celestian Sacrosancts and the Paragon Warsuits, and has enough core rule that makes them more dangerous and now no longer drains miracle dice, and plenty of stratagems to support them beyond that. In this one it looks like we've got 3 units of Celestian Sacrosancts with the maces that can be made pretty scary with the extra AP strats, 2 of them with Hospitals in them to make them tougher, and a Canoness with a Blessed Blade I guess would lead the other one for some free stratagems and damage punch. There's then yet more melee with some Minister and Priests leading some squads of Arco-Flagellants, more than Val and a big squad of Paragon Warsuits, a second squad beyond that with the Melters, a couple of Sororitas Rhinos that could be scouted forward with the Sanctifiers. They've got a whole bunch of Flamer shots, and interesting to see the new Ministorum warbands featuring here. I guess they might scout forward the Rhinos but might not necessarily stay in them, and then potentially get other units in if you wanted. In any case, pretty cool to see a big melee heavy list of Sisters Elites do well. Next up we've got the Imperial Knights. Pretty much all of their data sheets went up by around about 10% or so, though given just how crazily dominant they've been in most circles, that still didn't seem all that likely to completely put them out of the running. They certainly do appear to be doing rather well. The first week tournament win rates around about 52%, and kind of similar casual win rates from Goonhammer. It is quite nice to have good evidence their win rates dropped down really quite significantly though, being around about 58 or 59 or so, which is giving them far too much of an edge versus other armies out there. It still does look like they're right on the upper end of the power spectrum of 40k at the moment though. 1 event win outright and 2 more undefeated, plus a bunch of higher placings. I guess the faction at the moment though will be changing in really quite a big way shortly. Games Workshop's just announced that their Codex is going live for pre-order, so I guess they'll maybe only have around about another 3 weeks or so of tournament performance in their current form. Having a look at their undefeated lists and tournament winners, the makeup of their armies doesn't really seem to have changed in a huge way. Canis Rex is unsurprisingly still auto-include, the Knight Atropos still remains popular. In this list that went undefeated by Charles Gold, he has Canis, 2 Atropos and a Knight Lancer, plus a couple of Armiger Helverins and a Calidus Assassin to back them up. That doesn't seem too very different from a couple of other builds I'd seen. I had noticed another one of the undefeated ones had gone for a pair of Knight Crusaders. Will be interesting to see how things change again when the Knight book comes out though. Beyond those armies, I feel like there's really quite a lot of armies that are clustered around the sort of mid to upper mid tier of Warhammer 40k and doing rather well. Chaos Demons seem to have had some pretty good plus 50% win rates as well. Plus 1 list went undefeated at a tournament. They've generally been using Demon Incursion to pretty good success, usually playing around Monster Mash demons. I can't help but imagine that slightly fewer knights being around isn't going to be the worst thing for them. Necrons also seem to have had some pretty standout first week performance. Looks like they had 55% wins, though the more casual win rates is quite a bit lower down at 48. They did have lots of high placings, though lots of people playing them. I'd probably guess that win rates being quite that high is probably just doing well on 1 week, as opposed to reflecting a dramatic rise for them. They tended to be more around the sort of 49-50 kind of mark over the last meta. They certainly still look like they'll be one of the strong upper mid-tier factions though. For the rest of the armies of 40k, I'll just go through quickly. As mentioned, I wanted to focus on the things that seem to be doing more standout. And I think that fine balance of things, looking around these sort of mid-tier of things, isn't really going to be something that you learn very much from just 1 week of win rate data. It does seem that there's plenty of armies that you'd expect to be there in the sort of middle tier of Warhammer 40k. Space Wolves, Black Templars, Tyranids, Chaos Knights and World Eaters, all around the sort of 50% win rate mark. A few have had some tournament victories such as Space Wolves, Black Templars and Chaos Knights. It certainly doesn't look like these Spiky Knights are out of the running yet, though maybe not too surprised to see them just a little lower placed than the Imperials. Space Marines seem to have an unusually good week as well. Their win rates have usually been sitting at more sort of the 45% mark rather than the 51 that they got. I would guess that's probably just an unusually good week for them as opposed to them coming back with a vengeance. Otherwise, looking at least a little bit lower down the table, Blood Angels had low win rates, though one undefeated list last week. They seem to be doing well casually, and suspect they might be settling a bit more around the mid-tier to upper mid. Leagues of Votan don't seem to have done amazing with their first tournament weekend for their codex. Win rates are about 46%. They did win a tournament, though it was with their Index Oath band as opposed to their new codex detachments. Then we've got Grey Knights Guard, Tower Empire, and Admech Deathwatch, all in the sort of middle 40s. The Tower won a small grand tournament last week. And then at least for the lower performing armies for the first week of data, we've got these guys. I would certainly bear in mind though that I feel like the majority of these are going to be quite this low just due to random chance, which is expected in any 1 week of data. I feel like you can see that from an expected data point of view as well, given that the casual win rates of all of these is much higher. I think that's just purely because the casual data set has more data in it, so random low swings are a bit more balanced out. It might not be the best start for them, though I feel like for most of these a bit more data is needed. The Chaos Marines and Emperor's Children both won tournaments, the Emperor's Children quite a big one. I can't imagine many people are too surprised to see Orcs at the bottom of any list like this though. It does feel like Games Workshop needs to do something to help out 40k's greenskins with the incoming balance passes. Pre-update, their win rates were around about 43% or so. I certainly wouldn't expect them to drop from this in the long term, though they definitely need some help. In any case, interesting to get a first glimpse into which armies are doing well and in what ways they seem to be succeeding. Obviously with 1 week's data I certainly wouldn't get too stressed about these, though we'll be interested to hear your thoughts on the first glimpse of news and high performances. Which do you think will be the strongest factions for the next few weeks until any balance pass arises? As mentioned, a big thank you to the Bourbon City Brawl for sponsoring this one. If you want to attend a 2,000 point 40k grand tournament in the Kentucky kind of area, you can find them links down in the video description. If you've enjoyed the video, then feel free to subscribe to Auspex Tactics. I'll certainly keep the regular 40k videos coming, with new ones out just about every day. If you'd like to support the channel and keep the videos coming, Auspex Tactics does have a Patreon page as well, and you can find that links down in the video description below if you'd like to support. Channel patrons get a few advantages, seeing certain videos early, regular votes to see what sort of things come next on the channel, and automatic entry into the regular prize giveaways with a chance to win some big model kits each month. If any of that sounds good to you or you'd just like to help support, the link's down in the video description. In any case, a massive thank you for listening, and I'll hope to see you guys next time.